And I want to welcome all guests who join us tonight. Unfortunately, not live in person in Vienna, in Kreisky Forum, in his villa, with our guest John Kampfner, flying in from London and enjoying the nice atmosphere of the Austrian capital on a wonderful, beautiful, slightly cold late April evening. No, we are on Facebook Live, we are on Zoom Live, and it is still a big, big pleasure, John, to have you here tonight. So first of all, welcome to you.
Thank you very much. Danke, Tessa, und schönen guten Abend, liebe Gäste, liebe Zuschauer, liebe Zuhörer. Ich freue mich, hier zu sein, obwohl, wie Tessa gesagt hat, nur digital. Aber zum nächsten Mal werden wir alle miteinander sprechen und uns treffen in Wien. Aber wir haben eine Stunde über Deutschland, vielleicht ein bisschen über Österreich, über die Insel, Europa und das Leben zu reden.
Genau. Wir haben nämlich einen sehr guten Grund, uns heute zu treffen, weil Johns Buch gerade jetzt in Deutschland, in der deutschen Fassung und in Österreich und in der Schweiz natürlich auch erschienen ist. Das Buch heißt, warum Deutschland es besser macht. Und bevor die Österreicher jetzt gleich mal indigniert eine Augenbraue hochziehen und die Deutschen sich ein bisschen schämen, weil es gibt ja diesen deutschen Ausdruck, Selbstlob stinkt, man würde das also nie selber so sagen wollen, hast du das natürlich aus der Perspektive eines Briten geschrieben. Und wirst uns dann auch erklären, warum und wieso und worum es da eigentlich geht und was die Deutschen überhaupt besser machen. I'm not so sure they do, but we will discuss that. But let me introduce John a little bit to you, because John is in Britain a very well-known journalist, also a satirical author. He's a broadcaster, he's a commentator. John, you have been basically in, every English media. You have already written your columns, but you have also partly been the editor of the New Statesman between 2005 and 2008. But you were also later, when I came to London 11 years ago, you were working as the chief executive of the Freedom of Expression organization Index on Censorship till 2012. And I remember you were very active in trying to defend press freedom and the freedom of opinion, especially in countries which we have seen in the last 10 years go down in the ability to defend the freedom of expression for media and for journalists in particular. You have now a column in the Times, and you are basically sort of have been busy, of course, writing this book also. But also last year we met while you were writing a study for the Royal United Services Institute in London on the relationship of Germany with Russia and China, and how this has changed also in the last year, since those countries have become slightly less cooperative and slightly more undemocratic. And I was honored to write the study about the same subject from the Austrian perspective. So I did the kindergarten study, you did the one of the heavyweights, so to speak, of the grown-ups.
Ich bin nicht der Meinung.
Anyways, let's go straight into the talk about the book, because this is, of course, a little bit a provocation to say that Germany does it better, especially in this general way. So I would like to ask you just simply straight on, what does Germany do better? And why did you decide to write about that? And I'm also hoping that you can introduce us to this German edition of the book by reading from it in German, as your German is so excellently. Oh, I should have said that before, of course. You started also your career being in Germany, reporting on everything from the Berlin Berlin Wall fall to the fall of Soviet communism in Russia. So you have studied the German culture, language and politics inside out.
Aber vorher war ich auch in Bonn 2 Jahre.
Herrlich. I think I forgot that on
Hauptdorf.
Ja, Hauptdorf. Schön war's, wunderbar. But let's go to the book.
Ja.
Please let us know why.
Okay, also ich fange an, also nur ein paar Zeilen auszulesen, um ein kleine Soupçon, liebe Gäste, zu geben, und dann vielleicht machen wir eine Conversation und uns einander, und ich werde hoffentlich erklären, warum ich dieses Buch, wie du gesagt hast, Tessa, warum ich dieses Buch geschrieben habe. Also ich nehme also ein paar Zeilen von der Einleitung, und zwar: In seiner ersten Hälfte glich die Historie des modernen Deutschlands mit Krieg und Diktatur eine Horrorgeschichte. Seine zweite Hälfte ist aber auf bemerkenswerte Weise von Wiedergutmachung, Stabilität und Reife geprägt. Kein Land hat so viel Positives in so kurzer Zeit erreicht. Das ist jene Seite der deutschen Geschichte, von der ich berichten möchte. Vielen fällt es schwer, Deutschland als moralisches und politisches Vorbild zu sehen, wie du schon gemerkt hast. Die erstaunliche vielen Engländer, die auch heute noch Churchill und dem britischen Gemeinschaftsgeist unter den deutschen Luftangriffen auf London, dem Blitz, nachhängen, habe ich bereits mit einigen unbequemen Wahrheiten konfrontiert. Aber auch die Deutschen, die sich gerne zieren, Verantwortung zu übernehmen, werden sich herausgefordert fühlen von meinem Buch. Deutschland jetzt zurzeit steht vor vielen Problemen. Der Zustrom der Flüchtlinge von 2015 hat gesellschaftliche Spannungen verschärft. Das Vertrauen in die politischen Parteien schwindet. Viele Menschen, besonders im Osten des Landes, fühlen sich von den simplen Parolen des politischen Extremismus angesprochen. Das Wirtschaftswachstum hat sich durch eine überzogene Konzentration auf den Export, insbesondere nach China, durch eine alternde Bevölkerung und eine in Teilen marode Infrastruktur verlangsamt. Und wir auch hätten über diese Impfkrise in Deutschland, über diese Frage von, also diese gravierenden Misserfolge, eine altmodische Bürokratie, eine Langsamkeit bei Digitalisieren, ein Wort, das ich nie ausdrücken kann. Woher also das Vertrauen? Woher der Glaube an Deutschland? Ein Land wird genau wie eine Institution oder ein einzelner Mensch weniger an der Größe der Schwierigkeiten gemessen, die es zu bestehen gilt, als an der Art und Weise, wie sie überwunden werden. Unter diesem Aspekt kann man Deutschland nur beneiden. Es hat sich eine Reife erworben, die vielen anderen Ländern, und zwar fehlt. Das war in keiner Weise vorherbestimmt. Deutschland hat es sich hart erkämpft. Und letzte kleine Zitat hier. Der Streifzug, der mich ein Jahr lang durch Deutschland führte, machte mich nicht nachsichtig oder blind gegenüber seinen Fehlern. Sie werden hier alle angesprochen. Die Deutschen, die ich für dieses Buch interviewte, die prominente Politiker und CEOs internationaler Unternehmen, die Künstler, die Freiwilligen, die sich für Flüchtlinge engagieren, die alten Freunde und die Leute auf der Straße, die Zufallsbekanntschaften, sie alle, wirklich alle, ohne jede Ausnahme, runzelten die Stirn über die Idee und den Titel dieses Buchs. Zitiere: Das kann man so nicht sagen, protestierten sie, mal mit einem kleinen Einsätzchenschrei, mal mit einem verlegenen Lachen. Und dann ergingen sie sich in einer Litanei über die Probleme Deutschlands und das, was ihrer Ansicht nach alles falsch läuft.
Well, it was a good way for you to get a conversation going. If you you schmeichel your conversation partners, and then they sort of have to come up with all the critical things. But you also wrote, of course, the book, which has also a subtitle called ein bewundernder Blick von außen. You wrote it as a Brit and as a British citizen who has just been robbed of his European citizenship, at least sort of in your British identity, by Brexit. So we can feel in the book, of course, your anger about the fact that Britain, as one of the big and important European nations, turns it back on the European project, while Germany is sort of the stabilizer of the entire continent, and it's trying to control its own strength and try to fit into a union of European nations. Was this one of the drivers of your idea to write this book, to explain this post-Brexit European sentiment also?
Or as one German friend asked me rhetorically, maybe this was your form of therapy. Yeah. To a degree, yes. But the book is not about the UK, but of course, and it's not a binary book. And for those who haven't read the book or who haven't seen the recensionen, the reviews, which with one exception have all been incredibly positive. And that one exception, by the way, was my old colleague Simon Heffer in the Daily Telegraph, where I was the correspondent in Bonn, Berlin, Moscow, who called it...
The Daily Telegraph also has changed since that time. It became sort of the mouthpiece.
Anyway, he very poetically called it Brexit revenge porn, which I thought was actually quite nice. And I actually asked my publishers, could we put this on the cover of the updated English paperback coming out in June? I'm not sure what the answer is, but I think that would be quite fun. But no, this is not a book about only COVID. This is not a book only about Brexit. The reason for, well, there's two reasons, and again, they're personal. One is, for any of you who are British on this, at this event, or any of those of you who know Britain well, you go to any bookshop in Britain, and if you find a foreign affairs shelf, which is always a challenge, and if you find a Europe shelf, and if you find a Germany shelf, it gets smaller and smaller, pretty much the only books you will find are about the First World War and the Second World War. Now, there have been some honourable exceptions. I have them here on my shelf. Neil MacGregor's brilliant book, former British ambassador to Berlin, Paul Lever, some lovely books about Berlin, Rory MacLean, David Bowie. There are some nice non-war books, but the vast majority are about the war legacy, either military or Hitler or politics or something. And I just wanted to write a different book about Germany, a country, which brings me to my second reason, a country with which I have a complicated relationship. I am, as our beloved former Prime Minister Theresa May might have said, I am a typical citizen of nowhere. My father was Jewish from Bratislava, around the corner from you guys, who fled right after Hitler had invaded Czechoslovakia. So he had to go all the way through Germany. A lot of his family were killed in the concentration camps. He made it just, very nearly didn't, to England, and at the age of 13 established a new life. He then served in the British Army as a doctor, was sent to Singapore after the war, where he met my mother, who was a classic English from the county of Kent, working class nurse, Protestant, from the first generation working for the National Health Service. And they met in the military ward of the hospital in Singapore and lived there for 15 or 20 years, where I was born and my brothers and sisters. And so for me, and speaking different languages, and I've never found British identity in any way at variance with a European identity, just as Austrians feel it, as Germans feel it, as French, as anybody feel it. But sadly, that's not the way a lot of people feel it. And so that, again, was one of my reasons for writing this book. But most of all, I would say, and that's why I'd be intrigued to see the response. I mean, it had a lot of response when the book came out in English in Germany last September. The FAZ did a whole page. I did a Spiegelgespräch. I did a lot of other interviews with different newspapers and magazines. By the way, this Friday, I think, it may be postponed 1 week, I have a one-page Streit column in Die Zeit.
Oh, very nice.
I hope, with a very nice journalist, a commentator from Die Zeit called Jan Ross, who has written a book in praise of Boris Johnson. And so it was a...
How did that go?
Well, it was, I was extremely polite and respectful, but, and we did have a few meetings of minds on some things, but I find just one thought I have, which is when you look at the last 2 or 3 months, and some people in Germany and my friends, and not so much here, but Germans, saying, ha, your book, that's not looking so good now. We have the vaccine problems and everything else. To which my response is, isn't it interesting that in Britain, the first thing that has gone right, we celebrate as a national triumph, even though we have had, sadly, desperately sadly, one of the highest death tolls and death rates in the world. Up until recently, it was complete chaos here, as you know. And in Germany, everything was going well, except for the disaster of the European Commission's failure to negotiate properly on the vaccine. And that has left Germany, France, Austria, other countries a few months behind. People frustrated, angry, nervous. When will this end? But it's the first thing that you have got wrong. And so the first thing you get wrong, you indulge in an orgy of self-vilification and self-criticism. And the first thing that we get right, we think we've sort of won the football match.
Yeah, or again, the Blitz against the Nazis or something like that.
Exactly.
Yeah, that always plays in it. Aber ich finde...
Or football.
Or football, of course.
We scored and I've heard this from commentators and people, that we played a bad game, but we scored the only goal in the 90th minute, so we have won.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, you know, politics, pandemic as a football match.
Man muss aber schon auch sagen, also als du das Buch geschrieben hast, war Deutschland so Musterknabe, so wie Österreich, ein Land, das es gut im Griff durch relativ klare Politik auch relativ viel Vertrauen in der Bevölkerung ausgelöst hat, während Boris Johnson letzten Frühling nicht verstanden hat, dass es überhaupt eine Gefahr ist und noch Hände geschüttelt hat, bis er selber irgendwie in der Intensivstation gelegen ist und so weiter und so fort. Ja. Es ist aber so, dass du auch in der deutschen Ausgabe jetzt, hast du das auch noch im Januar 21 gewissermaßen versucht zu beschreiben und auch ein bisschen abzufangen, dass der Vakzinwettkampf sich zugunsten der Brexit-Regierung auf der Insel gut ausgewirkt hat. Und das ist natürlich nicht zu bestreiten, dass der Grund dafür nicht nur ist, dass die Briten eine starke Tradition haben, Forschung zu unterstützen mit staatlichen Mitteln, weil AstraZeneca wurde schließlich von Steuergeldern erforscht, ja? Also der Impfstoff. Aber auch, dass das, was Boris Johnson in seinem Treffen mit seinen Erzbrexitieren in der Tory Party vor ein paar Wochen gesagt hat und das dann sofort geleakt wurde, der Grund, warum er so schnell und so voll zugeschlagen hat, war Capitalism and Greed. Und das ist natürlich genau der Gegenpol jetzt zu diesem deutschen, vernünftigen europäischen Ding, wo man sich dann schon mit einer gewissen Bitterkeit fragen kann, ob Nationalism und Capitalism und Greed in manchen Situationen, wenn es uns sozusagen auch um die Impfung und die Sicherstellung der Bevölkerung, der eigenen geht, ob das dann nicht auch einen Vorteil hat.
Look, I mean, I think there are some big conclusions to draw from the vaccine problem, but there is also a tendency to overinterpret. On the overinterpretation, just imagine if the 4 European countries that had been planning to do it themselves, Germany, France, Italy, and the Netherlands, had done it last summer, we wouldn't be having this conversation. It was through the European Commission, whether it's von der Leyen's fault or her officials or whatever, it was a disaster. It was a perfect lesson in how not to negotiate with pharmaceuticals, how not to distribute. It was a disaster. Now, you have to say that and accept it. And then the ridiculous, slightly politics-infused hostility to AstraZeneca, again, gave mixed messages. But look, by June, July, there will be an Ausgleichung. Everybody of a certain age, over 50 or whatever, will have received all their things. So there has been an unnecessary delay of a few months in the European Union, on the continent of Europe. That's it. That is not enough to draw big conclusions.
Well, that is certainly it. I mean, also, I have to say that always at that point in the debate, when people are calling the Commission being responsible for that and Ursula von der Leyen, I mean, the European Commission is only as strong as the member states make.
Yeah, but if you give an institution jurisdiction.
Yeah, but basically that's the problem.
But they should. So maybe they should
have the health overview, and was given a task without the teeth, because the prime ministers were running around here, especially the Austrian Prime Minister Sebastian Kurz, for example, saying that it should not be costing too much, and he's one of these frugal prime ministers that, for also other reasons, for the recovery fund, which is one of the really big important projects of the last year's European Union politics, was always pushing to make it smaller and not as, in that sense, of course, also not as effective.
But I mean, there are some lessons, and I think, as I say in my book, the test of a country's maturity is not, do you get into crises and problems, right? We all do in our lives. But how do you deal with them now? And I've always, and I don't know the situation enough in Austria about public services and about, so you can explain and others can explain. But as far as Germany is concerned, you don't have to be a Brit. You can be anything to sort of see how old-fashioned the bureaucracy is, how paper-based it is. I mean, I was astounded going to Familienarzt, and everything is written down on paper. It's like the 1970s. And you know, because of the double legacy of the Nazi Zeit and the DDR and the Stasi and the whole Datenschutz obsession, the reluctance to have medical records easily accessible is understandable but crazy. And those sorts of things, the need for digitization of Germany, which Merkel has been talking about for years, the bureaucracy, which can be overwhelming. But there's another thing, and it's a psychological thing, and it's both the good side and the bad side of Germany. And I would say it's the langsam aber sicher approach to life. Nothing happens until the last thing has been agreed, which can work incredibly well. I would say, in terms of, I'm a great admirer of the German constitution, the division of powers, the fact that you bring everybody along with you, the fact that politics is not performance, but it is negotiation, it's details, it's committee work. It's quite often boring, but it is a much more professional and responsible way. In Britain, it's theatre. As one Berlin friend said to me in the middle of the chaos after Brexit, and the parliamentary votes in the House of Commons, she said that she had given up her subscription to Netflix because she got all the entertainment she needed watching the British Parliament.
Yeah.
To which I said, well, you know, I don't want a clown as the Prime Minister. I don't, you know, if I want to see a clown, I go to the circus. And so, you know, to me, that sense of responsibility in Germany and thoroughness is great. Aber the risk aversion, particularly in technology, in innovation, is holding Germany back hugely. And I remember in one of my previous jobs, when I was running the creative industries body for the UK, and we were doing a bilateral event with South Korea. And I met two 25-year-old young men, Koreans, who were explaining that their latest project was going to go unicorn. It was going to make billions and be hugely successful. They were 25. And I said, is this brilliant? Is this your first project? And they laughed. They said, no, it's our sixth project. And I said, what happened to your other five? And they smiled and said, oh, they all went bust. You know, to fail fast is a really good thing. But in Germany, I was talking to Joe Kaiser, the CEO of Siemens. You can talk to young entrepreneurs in Berlin, in Hamburg, in Munich. That's not possible. Mm. You know, your family is looked down by your neighbors, your credit card rating goes down, your bank asks questions. So there has to be, now how do you combine this wonderful Zuverlässigkeit, this wonderful inclusiveness of the German body politic with a more risky approach to innovation? If you combine that, then you really machen it better.
This is a problem that you have not only in Germany, to make the entrepreneurial state stronger and become more of a startup nation, which particularly for Germany is complicated. We have similar problems in Austria, and France or Italy are also not exactly the fast moving societies also in these respects. Mm. But what I really like very much about your book is that you, and I see this as one of the crucial things about your book, thoughts about your book, that you look at the crucial dates in German history after the war. And of course, one of the very clear founding characteristics of Germany was that it had to be wieder aufgebaut. Und der Wiederaufbau was something that actually started to make the British feel a little bit uneasy, because the Germans got a Marshall Plan and the British, as the winners of the war, didn't. So Germany got actually help to get back on the feet, because it was clear that only a stable Germany with a functioning economy could lead to a democratic society. So this is, you describe this very well in the book, and I think that's quite an important point also for the difference in the feeling of the European nations, how they look now on their history. And the second point, of course, is the Vergangenheitsbewältigung, as it was sort of called, or the sort of Wiedergutmachung, which all are terms that you wouldn't really use anymore nowadays. But that is the crucial point, I think, for you as a Jewish boy growing up in Britain and looking at the Germans basically as the Nazi nation. And this change in the way how Germany behaved in the last decades as a democratic society, clearly addressing the problems of their past, or our past. We Austrians are sort of part of this package, although it took us a generation longer to look at it in all aspects. But this is something that I think must have been very important for you to express, this way how a nation deals with with its own history.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's some fascinating comparisons now. An American, again, well, she's completely Jewish, Brooklyn author called Susan Nyman, who lives in Berlin, has done a wonderfully interesting book comparing Vergangenheitsbewältigung, Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung with America and slavery. And you now throw in Black Lives Matter and the whole question of colonial legacies. It's fascinating that in France, Macron is pushing very hard to give back some of the art that's been seized. The whole discussion around different histories, one shouldn't compare, but one should deploy similar open-eyed approaches. Interestingly, also the opening of the new Humboldt Forum in Berlin and the whole question of Germany First Reich Germany's own colonial legacy, although very small that it was, and all of that. So yeah, these things are incredibly important. Just to your point, there are 5 key moments in my book. 1949, which was the Grundgesetz and really the start of the Federal Republic, the start of the division of Germany, but really the end of the full occupation. And I could talk forever about the Grundgesetz. I'm a Grundgesetz nerd, but I just think it's an incredible document. And one of the ironies is that British lawyers were part of the formulation. And I keep on thinking, if we can create such good constitutions for other people, why do we have this ridiculous non-constitution that we have here? That's the first one. The second one is 1968. And I think it's interesting. A lot of people think that because of the Nuremberg trials, Germany kind of came to terms with the war very quickly. As most people know, in Germany, that didn't happen. In fact, the first generation was largely in denial, and the 1968 generation, which also manifested itself in violence, as well as peaceful protests. But that was the big caesura, that was the big break with the past. So 68 was an amazingly positive development. And then 1989-90, which to me is the start of modern Germany. It is the first time, possibly in history, or maybe 1871 to 1914, but it's really the first time that Germany is comfortable in its skin. And really the development of so much arises from that. We could also talk about 2015 and the Flüchtlinge, the 1 million, and Merkel's incredible bravery, which, in spite of the rise of the AfD and all the problems that have arisen, as I say in my book, I defy anybody to think of a country that could have dealt with these 2 crises, Wiedervereinigung und die Flüchtlingskrise, so well as Germany did. There was no Germanic rule book for reunification. What do we do on a Thursday? What do we do lunchtime on Tuesday? Everything was dynamic and minute by minute. And for all the problems with the Treuhandanstalt and Besserwessis and all of that, it is a remarkable achievement, which I know some friends and acquaintances in the Ostländer, particularly older ones, like to disagree with me about, but I just think, okay. And then the refugee crisis, 1 million of the world's poorest, most destitute people.
Let's come to this in a second.
Yeah.
Just so, because you were going now through all these really crucial points that explain also why you wrote this book. And I think they're quite interesting also parallels to the Austrian history. And I, for example, thought it was very interesting that you mentioned Raoul Hilberg, the historian, who is an Austrian Jewish historian, was an Austrian Jewish historian, and his Vernichtung of die europäischen Juden, which he wrote in 1954. And he couldn't find a publisher. Yeah. And then it was finally published in Chicago in the 60s, and it was published in Germany for the first time in 1982. Yeah. So it's really quite interesting to think how we got already used our own look at the history, because we as generations of people around 50 grew up with the work that the 68ers did in Germany on that matter. Mm-hmm. And in Austria, they tried that too, but it was much harder because the Austrians had this loophole of finding that they were the first victims of Hitler. And so they didn't have to do any Wiedergutmachung and restitution, look into their own soul and all these kind of things, which then led to the fact that what happened when Richard von Weizsäcker had his big speech to take responsibility, but also Willy Brandt knelt down in the at the ghetto memorial in Warsaw. In Austria, it was still relatively difficult to get the public to make understand that it's not a question of guilt, but of responsibility. Also.
And also, don't forget, and I'm not being trivial, Meryl Streep.
Holocaust. Yeah.
Holocaust was probably, you can have politicians making grand speeches, but that American series, dubbed into German, was, many people say, the game changer.
It's interesting that you mentioned this now, because I talked to my father about your book yesterday, and about the Holocaust series, and he said that he was responsible at the time in the Austrian television for film productions, and he, together with the WDR, bought it and broadcast it, and the initial response was horror, and especially at the level of the responsible people. They were saying like, no, we don't want to send this at all. This is all, terrible. I mean, it's concentration camp and gas chambers. And they did send it, and it became, as you say, in Austria too, a very, very clear Meilenstein in looking at the history of the Second World War, not only in the sense of having lost the war and all this, but also being responsible for what happened to the Jews and whoever else was sent to the camps. So it's true that this changed, I think, the atmosphere very much. But what you, from your British perspective, also mentioned is that in Britain, this type of Vergangenheitsbewältigung and look at your own problems has not happened, really. Do I understand that correctly?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that still both countries are trapped by the war. And I think, actually, I hope, I'm probably being very arrogant in saying this, but I hope my book has something can help in this, because Germans just really struggle to hear such full-blooded compliments about themselves. And I think partly that is genuine, mostly that is genuine, but I think a little bit is artifice. I think a little bit is an excuse not to take on the big Verantwortung for the world. And this is my challenge in the book, particularly the book which is a little bit different, the German book, to the English one. The German one doesn't have any explanation about Germany, because I just assumed Germans.
People would maybe.
They don't need it. But my Herausforderung is, it's very easy to say, oh, we're so terrible, we can't do any of this stuff around the world. We are whiter than white, we're a peace-loving country, we don't like war, we don't like spending money on stuff. We don't like to confront Putin, we don't like to confront Xi Jinping, it's all too awful. And it allows, in some ways, Germany to live in a world of purity, whereas the real world is shades of grey. And particularly in the Trump period, if Trump had won, God help Germany, God help the world, if Trump had won a second time. But even now, and perhaps at least as much under Biden, there is a responsibility for Germany as Europe's most powerful country to step up and not to move on, because that suggests an insensitivity, a forgetting about the past, which is always wrong, but you can understand, learn, commemorate the past, keep the past as all ever present, but also live in the present and the future. And I think that is the big challenge. So that's the burden of history on Germany. The burden of history on Britain is that we think all problems will be solved if we lie in the bath, drinking a beer, waving a plastic flag, and singing Rule Britannia. And we are obsessed with past glories. And we live in the past. Fascinating discussions about the death of the Duke of Edinburgh, fascinated that it was lead item on German TV, French TV, everything. But is this possibly the end of this era in which we are measured incessantly by what happened in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s? Because we have to, because we're going backwards. We are being held back by the past.
Yeah. Before we sort of get to the end of our era here, we should invite people to ask us a question, which I want to do here. Und auch wirklich, ihr könnt auch die Fragen auf Deutsch stellen.
Ja, sicher.
John würde sich darüber freuen. Also keine Scheu haben, bitte. Und wir können auf Facebook Fragen eingeben, die Jutta, unsere Tech Queen in Vienna, vorlesen kann. Und auf Zoom participants can of course also raise their hands or type it into the chat and make yourself heard. And you can ask them, und ihr könnt dann die Fragen auch selber stellen. Also bitte bereitet welche vor. Wir springen noch kurz schnell in die deutsche Gegenwart, auch politisch, weil eine der großen Thesen deines Buches ist, dass die deutsche Politik auch so erfolgreich war, weil sie sich auf Konsens und Koalitionen berufen hat, was sicherlich stimmt. Aber auch da ist natürlich eine große Trendwende oder Zeitenwende zu spüren. Die kommenden Wahlen jetzt, das Ende der Ära von Angela Merkel, heißt auch, dass unter Umständen die bisherigen Koalitionspartner keine Mehrheit mehr haben, während die Grünen sozusagen die neue zweite starke Kraft werden könnten. Die haben auch heute ihre Kanzlerkandidatin präsentiert.
Ja,
das heißt, die werden schon einen richtigen Kampf ums Kanzleramt mitführen, zumindest mit der Perspektive. Und da schreibst du auch im Buch und vor allen Dingen am Ende des Buches sehr stark, dass das eine Hoffnung ist für dich bei der Kritik, dass Deutschland ein bisschen langsam auf Sachen reagiert, dass eben gerade diese neue grüne Kraft sein könnte.
I did a tweet earlier today in response to Baerbock's, the decision of the Greens to have her. And I wrote, to those in the UK disparaging about Germany, and to those Germans perennially self-flagellating, remember you could well be getting the world's first green government and your second successive female leader. So, you know, there are, you know, the end of the Merkel era. I'm a great fan of Merkel, but as we all remember, back before the pandemic, she was forced to pre-announce her retirement. Everybody thought she'd gone on too long in 2018. And then she had a great 6-9 months at the start of the pandemic. But 16 years, it's enough. And it's not just a change of person. Germany needs a new generation. Now, who knows what the result will be, and Koalitionsverhandlungen and all of that. But whether the Greens emerge as party number 1 or party number 2, which is guaranteed there will be at least party number 2, it will be the start of a new era with Baerbock and Habeck. I haven't seen much in Armin Laschet to make me very excited. Markus Söder, I don't know so much. And in fact, this evening, I think the CDU, if they haven't already, whilst we've been speaking, they're about to be discussing which of the two. Scholz is not particularly exciting, but I do think that the Greens are, for all the contradictions, and there are so many contradictions in the German climate movement and the German climate record, but you do get a sense that this generational change couldn't come more quickly enough, but was also coming at the right time. And it has to be a very different feeling government to the one before. It needs to be radical on the digital agenda and on the reform agenda. It needs to be braver internationally. And I find it fascinating that the Greens are much more hardline on Russia and China than the SPD and even parts of the CDU, particularly the CDU in the Ausländer. So I think it's you know, a genuinely fascinating period coming up for Germany, and everybody will miss Merkel. You know, Mutti has been the great shield of the country for so long, and also the world will miss her in international affairs. And also for Germany, it will be harder to guarantee the status, because Merkel acquired such status internationally. It'd be interesting to see that Macron is very much pushing himself as Europe's leader.
Yeah, it will be certainly a change of tune on the European level, but also in Germany, where the Germans are watching Austria closely in that respect, because we do have the Green Party in the coalition government as the smaller part. Yeah. And that, of course, is always a tricky position to be in for a smaller coalition partner to make their own politics, you know, count. Anyway, I saw we have a few questions already. Jutta, do you want to read us or put people from the Zoom chat directly into our conversation?
Yes, I would love to. So far, there are no risen hands, so nobody wants to talk to us yet, but there are two questions. I will just read the first one. It says, a comparison of UK and Germany I really like says that while you can get insurance for just about anything in Germany, a nation of engineers who strive to design and control systems, you can bet on just about anything in the UK, a nation of seafarers used to uncertainty. Do you have any views about that?
That's a very fascinating point, Lucas. I was interested actually with the Bundestagswahlen, and the political betting is very new in Germany, and it still has not been very accepted. You can bet, as you say, on anything in the UK. I mean, that is just like the German langsam aber sicher has its positive and negative. This sort of seafaring, buccaneering island thing can be quite attractive in some ways. As we discussed earlier, it allows for more risk taking, for more innovation. I remember at the beginning of, or the worst point of the crisis on the vaccinations, von der Leyen said, well, the European Union is a tanker and Britain is a speedboat, which I thought was a rather strange, and I think she didn't mean it to sound so positive for Britain, because most people would rather be on a speedboat than a tanker. If they're in the sea, it's certainly more fun to be on a speedboat. So there is something about this. And yes, you're right. I mean, the German insurance market is astonishing. I can't remember what I write in the book, but the value of German insurance policies is greater than per capita GDP, or something astonishing such as that. So this desire always to sort of wrap yourself in protection, which insurance is intended to be, is a fascinating one. Wouldn't it be great if we could find a sweet spot between this responsible state and society and a more buccaneering, risk-taking mentality? That would be almost the perfect society, but nobody's found it yet.
We need more balance in that, probably. Thank you, Lucas, for this question. Jutta, do we have questions from Facebook?
No, on Facebook there are no questions so far. So please, people on Facebook, feel free to type in. There is one more question on Zoom. It is a quite long statement, so I will pick out the questions. It says, a more critical view of someone who grew up 5 kilometers from Germany and still follows it closely from where I am. How can anyone who cares about human rights not be critical of German pragmatism of doing a deal with Erdogan on refugees and the treatment of Greece during their financial crisis?
Yeah, and also saying rose-colored glasses and
yes, it goes on.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I agree. I mean, my most critical chapter, by far, in the book is on foreign policy. I hugely struggle with. I'm pretty hard line on human rights. I mean, Tessa mentioned that I ran a freedom of expression organization. You know, having lived and worked in the former Soviet Union, as it was still the Soviet Union, and then in Russia as it was emerging, it was a time of great optimism. And what has happened to Russia, this horrible mixture of money-making and sort of neo-fascism, a sort of Latin American, dark glasses wearing, corrupt state. I really struggle with Putin Versteher in Germany, or there are some here, or wherever. And similarly, the sort of corporate car making, deal making that goes on with China. And I'll come to Turkey in a second. I do struggle with all of this. That said, one shouldn't, I'm not trying to be uncharacteristically pro-British, because I mean, our Brexit referendum was influenced, one assumes, by Russian money. Boris Johnson sells his not very good tennis playing skills to any Russian oligarch or oligarch's wife that wants to fund the Conservative Party coffers. London became Londongrad and the money laundering center of the world. George Osborne, when he was finance minister, rolled out the red carpet for the Chinese. Everybody is doing it. The deal with Erdogan on refugees, yes, now that's stemmed the refugee flow. But I would also, and so I accept all of these points. I don't necessarily accept the point about Greece, by the way, on the financial crisis. I followed it at the time, and I've read a lot, including Varoufakis's book afterwards. I'm not quite sure whether Europe would have benefited from just some massive bailout of Greece, no questions asked. I do believe in tight monetary control. And, Greece was absolutely not exercising that, and other southern countries haven't exercised that. But yeah, a deal was done with Erdogan. Erdogan is a unsavory character. But again, I just ask you, 1 million people in Germany, and these were people with the most terrible trauma, physical, mental, having abandoned all their goods, everything, families split, orphan children. For Germany to have absorbed so many people, of course with problems, but with so few problems, again, I do think that is a propensity. I accept, Alexander, you say you not necessarily from Germany, but nearby, to see the glass as half empty rather than half full.
Well, but it's also that it polarized the society a lot. I mean, I am completely with you. I think it was brave, and it was a sign of humanity at the point when others closed their borders, what Angela Merkel did. But it was very heavy on the society in Germany. It was also a similarly heavy situation in Austria at that point. Austria also took 100,000, which is more or less the equivalent of 1 million to the Germans. But you also write in your book, of course, that half of the people who came are now in jobs. Some of them, at least in Austria, speak better German than some of their Austrian compatriots. And it's certainly not a story of defeat in the face of a human action, which we saw in the refugee crisis. And that's also where Angela Merkel's place in the history book will probably be looked at in a positive way. I wanted to ask, to round up our debate maybe a little bit on the Germany in Europe, because of course this is the old Kissinger saying that Germany is too small for the world, but too big for Europe. What do you foresee happening, especially when Merkel goes and you have someone like Markus Söder coming up, being stronger, maybe bringing this new German sentiment of more Selbstbewusstsein to the stage? Because normality for the German strength is possibly a danger to all the other small nations in Europe.
You've absolutely put your finger on the big challenge. Selbstbewusstsein is a good thing. It depends how you exercise it. But a confident Germany is good for Europe and good for the world. A Germany that is underconfident is bad for Europe and bad for the world. But of course, there will always be problems. That's in the nature of politics and diplomacy. And the European, and one further point, it's an obvious point, but always is worth reminding, that one of the many tragedies of Brexit is that it has deprived Germany of probably the one country that thought most closely in foreign policy and in economic policy, along with the Netherlands. Germany, UK, and Netherlands, probably the three closest. So Germany is more exposed now in Europe. And Europe is Putin, around China, the Belt and Road, the authoritarian regimes in Hungary and Poland, and the abuse of human rights. And Europe is at a very difficult moment. I mean, Europe has always been one problem and then another problem, but it is, and it is going to have to work out both the question of integration, now that the Brits are not there causing problems. Europe can integrate much more quickly if it wishes to. And if it wishes to, and if it wishes to give European institutions more power, then it has to give it more capability and more money with the power, as we have seen with the vaccines. But it also has to sort out its allegiances, its alliances. Is Europe really the third pole between America and China? And what does that mean? Does that mean it's neutral on these issues? I hope not. It needs a new relationship, a new transatlantic relationship, because America is not going to go back to Europe in the way that it was before. It doesn't want to, and Europe doesn't want to. But Europe still hasn't found what this third pillar means. So there are huge questions, but they will only be solved by a confident Germany.
Oh, that is for sure. And also, I'm not very much for neutral positions, especially not in this world where we need to really take positions and fight for them, also for our values. I think we have one more question here from Ron Wills. Do you want to read that, Jutta?
Yes, of course I will.
Before we end.
It says, what do you think about Germany's stance on the Nord Stream pipeline?
Horrific. And again, that's one of my biggest criticisms. I think the point in the book where apart from all the stuff in the introduction about Brexit, where I was most angry is about Gerhard Schröder and his cozying up to Putin, the fact that he was negotiating his Rosneft and Gazprom jobs while he was still Chancellor. And that's where I was slightly despairing of Germany. And I've still never got a clear answer from friends in journalism about why this wasn't a bigger scandal. To me, we have at the moment a mini scandal over former Prime Minister David Cameron lobbying on behalf of a company, doing all kinds of things. And it seems to be very deep-rooted what Cameron was up to. But Schröder was doing this while still in government and with a state, whether you call it an enemy state or an adversarial state or whatever you call it, it's certainly not a friendly state. And
well, at the time it wasn't, 15 years later now the situation looks rather different. At the time, people were still trying to figure out, not necessarily as Russia watchers sitting. I mean, I was in Russia then, but it was still a little bit of a more open situation than it is now.
I mean, there's one thing to, I remember Tony Blair going to the opera with Putin in St. Petersburg, and they were all being friendly with each other. Yeah, I remember that era, the first 5 years of Putin, he was prepared to give the West a chance, and the West was prepared to give him a chance. So I can understand that. It's different to getting a job with somebody. That's quite different. And the Nord Stream pipeline undermines Ukraine. It undermines the Baltic states. You know, so it's not going to stop now. I think Biden appears to have said we're going to let it go because it's 99% completed, and what's the point of just dragging this out forever? But I think my prediction is that Biden will want payback from Germany for letting this through, and will want a much tougher approach on Russia. And we may see it in the next few days. We're all worried about Alexei Navalny and what will happen to him. We're worried about Ukraine. You know, there's some very unpleasant events going on with Russia literally now as we speak.
Bad news to come there, I'm afraid. Thank you very much. We were talking about John Kampfner's book, Warum Deutschland es besser macht, das jetzt auf Deutsch herausgekommen ist nach einem big success in Britain last fall. So please go out and get it and read it and discuss it, because I think there are a few very, very important thoughts in here, how modern states can deal with their historical faults, but also with the challenges of the 21st century, and where to go, create a more sort of entrepreneurial state, a little bit more of a sort of risk-taking government leadership, but by still keeping something intact, what the Germans and the Austrians know is very important for them, a kind of soziales Netzwerk and a gewisse
the great German word which has no translation, mitmachen.
Mitmachen. Yeah.
Which is a real sense of people doing it together, which you don't have in individualized states. Tessa, before you throw me off this call, there's one colleague who was watching and said, thanks for a thought-provoking, over-optimistic view on Germany. So my challenge to those of you who will read this book is, am I optimistic, which I hope is good? Am I over-optimistic, which I'm sure would be a criticism, and I hope not.
Thank you very much, John, for coming on this book presentation. Unfortunately, not in person, but virtually. And I hope you all enjoyed the book. Thank you very much and have a good evening, everyone.
Schönen Abend. Ciao.
Bye.
Ciao, ciao.